HobbyKing and today I am here with an older project of mine, the HobbyKing or Zeta Phantom FX-61. I bought this plane a few years back with the idea in mind to convert it into some kind of experimental Luftwaffe bomber, a cheap version of the Horten 229 if you will. And of course these kind of planes come with retracts. And that brought me to the first mod of this plane. And because this plane comes in a pusher configuration, like many flying wings, I had to use really long retract struts to give the rear prop enough clearance. It looked really cool, but unfortunately it also made the plane really unstable during takeoff or landing. So I tinkered around with it for a few years to solve the stability problems. Thicker struts, bigger wheels, smaller wheels. I even installed suspension struts and changed the retracts to a different type, but nothing really worked. I still liked the idea of a flying wing bomber, but what this project needed was a totally new approach, which came to me in the shape of an older flight test video which I saw on YouTube, where Josh and his buddies converted an flying wing from a push into a twin engine pull configuration. This sounded like a really good idea, and it would also solve most of my problems in one single move. And of course, two engines are always cooler. So I started to look for parts online while I ripped everything out of the old plane. Engines, retracts, steering, everything. Surprisingly, it didn't take me very long to find a few fitting engine nacelles online. From this point on, everything seemed to fall into its place more or less on its own. New engines, new ESCs, new props, new spinners, retracts, everything. Of course, it took me a few hours to change all the parts to fit the new borrowed idea. For this project I used the engine nacelles from an older HobbyKing Durafly model, the de Havilland Comet. They seem to have the right shape and size for this project and were relatively cheap. I installed a few extra cooling vents for the ESCs. Fitting the new motors and all the cables into the nacelles was not that easy. But with a little bit careful planning and a few try and errors, it worked. But what I really liked about the nacelles was the pre-installed retract mount, which made it really easy to install the electric retracts. After gluing everything together, I had to fit the nacelles to the Phantom's wings, which is actually not as easy as it might sound, because the nacelles had a bit of a curvature to fit the wings of the Durafly de Havilland. But of course, after a little bit of milling, cutting and sanding, they fitted pretty good. So I went on with a mount for the engine cowling. I used my Dremel to mill small pockets into the form of the nacelle to glue in 2mm polystyrene plates, so I could use screws to screw on the engine cowling. After that it was time to fit the retracts, and of course I had to bend the struts to fit the engine nacelles. On this nacelle there are no gear doors or gear covers, so the landing gear will look a bit like the landing gear of a B-17. Fitting wheels for the whole thing were pretty easy to find, so no problem there. And as you can see in the next picture, I went a little bit overboard with the ESC, but I wanted to make sure that it's not too small or too weak. So I went with a 30 amp ESC for the motor, which in the current configuration is totally overkill because the whole thing will only draw like 15 amps. After that I did a quick test of the retracts, and then of course I had to do the whole thing all over again. Remember, two engines now. After that I chose the position of the nacelles and draw their outlines onto the wing. I fitted all the wires into the cable duct and used epoxy and a few toothpicks to secure the nacelles on the wing. Because we have two retracts in the front and we also have two rudders, I thought it would be a good idea to go with two tail wheels too. So I reinforced the rudder with beechwood blocks. The only problem I had was to find fitting spinners which had enough room to fit the props I chose for the engines. The spinners I found work, but I'm still not super happy with them, because the original idea was to give this plane counter-rotating propellers. So I'm still on the hunt for better spinners and counter-rotating props for this plane. Anyway, after putting everything together, here are the first few pictures of what this thing is supposed to look like. Don't expect too much of it, because there's no color and such, of course. It's just a dry fit. But it gives you a general idea, I guess. Of course, there's a lot of work to be done here. The canopy, for example, is one I borrowed from a Park Zone Mosquito. The turret in the back is one from a HobbyKing B17. Because I'm very fond of lights on my planes, I started to install a few LEDs. Not too much, just a few landing lights and a few position lights on the wings and the rudders. After finishing the lights, I snatched my transmitter and started with the programming. Since this plane does not come with a rudder, in its standard configuration at least, and I do have two engines now, I wanted to incorporate something from my Horizon delta ray, which is using differential thrust to steer the plane in the air or on the ground. After checking everything again, I thought it would be the right time for the little taxiing test, so I went out to the field to see how she behaves on the ground. And I have to say I was surprised. She handled way better than I expected, to be honest. Maneuverability is good and fine, but the most important thing was that she was rock solid on the ground. Meaning no tendency to tilt to one side or the other, and not even a hint of nosing over, even at higher speeds. And it was not even correctly balanced. The plane was totally nose heavy. Oh, and by the way, excuse the bad picture quality. My GoPro died on me on the field, low battery, so I actually had to ask a buddy of mine to use my cell phone and shoot a few scenes for this video. After the successful taxiing test, the only thing left to do was to go home, check the CG and wait for a day with decent weather. And here we are a few weeks later. An early spring or late winter Sunday with actually decent weather. Not too cold, sunny even, but with a good wind of about 15 kph from the south. Not ideal, but good enough.
So, Wind. Ja, dann. Schauen wir mal. Okay.
That this maiden flight had an interesting start is not an understatement. I'm pretty sure you can agree on that one. I was actually a bit surprised that the plane jumped so quickly into the air. And the fact that the elevator trim was obviously wrong made things a little more interesting than I usually prefer. But there was something else that went wrong during the takeoff. When I almost lost control of the plane, I pushed the throttle to maximum, which jerked the plane very hard to the left. Something that would not have happened with counter-rotating propellers. Anyway, after this horrible takeoff, I put the gear up and started to cruise around. And after we corrected the wrong elevator trim, I started to get a feel for the plane.
Ja, sie sinkt aber. Ja, das sind ja echt gut. Wir haben auf den Seiten. Ja. So, ich werde mal steigen und dann gucken wir mal, was die Luft dran ist.
Since the plane was cruising around okay now, it was time to go on with the tests. And the first thing on my list were the air brakes. I might have to add that I tested the air brakes with engines on and with no up elevator. The first setting, I guess you can see that clearly on the picture, led to a significant drop, and setting number 2 almost pushed this plane into a stall. So I definitely have to adjust the settings for the brakes.
Ich mach mal Motoren aus, mal sehen wie er gleitet. Was für eine Aufregung. Ja, das ist immer der Erstflug. Man muss bedenken, wir haben auch ganz schön ein bisschen Böen und Wind. Ja, ja.
Next thing on my list was to test the differential thrust in flight, which actually worked really well.
Oh ja, das geht gut. Ja? Das ist schön. Ja, da kannst du auch mit Ruder fliegen, brauchst keine Querruder. Ja. Das ist cool. So, dann werden wir versuchen, ein paar Landeanflüge zu machen. Ja, ich versuche erstmal, mal gucken.
Because the wind died down a little, I thought it would be a good idea to try a landing approach or two. First thing I wanted to try was what some people call a dead stick approach. Glide path and speed looked actually very promising, so when I was about 6 meters over the field, I decided that I would actually land the plane and put the wheels down. As you can see, I actually managed to put that down pretty decent, which was kind of surprising considering all the other landings I had with the older version of it. And of course I know I need way more testing and even a few changes here and there. Still, I'm pretty happy with the result. So I guess this is it for today. And of course, as always, if you have any questions about the mod or the plane, send me a little note and I try to answer it. Thanks for watching and have fun at the flying field. Morbid Fan 66 out.